Without my constant charity, he would be sleeping on a park bench right now. My stepmother's voice cut through the quiet courtroom with a sharp, arrogant confidence that caused several people in the gallery to shift their eyes toward me. She sat perfectly straight beside her high-priced lawyer, wearing that familiar, victorious smirk she used whenever she felt she completely owned the narrative. The judge turned his gaze to me, his face an unreadable mask of authority. For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of the ventilation system and the steady clicking of the stenographer's machine. I quietly stared at the woman who had spent over 2 decades telling anyone who would listen that she was my ultimate savior. The word savior felt like a sick joke, a fairy tale she had manufactured to maintain absolute control. She had drilled this exact fable into our relatives, our neighbors, her church group, and now, she was trying to sell it to a court of law. In her carefully crafted version of reality, I was nothing but an ungrateful child, who would have been utterly destitute without her profound generosity. She loved portraying herself as the saintly, self-sacrificing guardian while framing me as the deceitful villain who repaid her love with absolute betrayal. The flaw in her strategy was that lies only survive when nobody demands cold, hard evidence, and on this particular morning, I had brought everything. The judge slowly clasped his hands together on his desk, peering down intensely at a thick manila folder resting right in front of him. "So," he said with a measured, deliberate tone, looking over his reading glasses, "they truly have no idea about any of this." My stepmother's confident smirk suddenly faltered, turning into a slight frown, while her attorney shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. "Know about what, Your Honor?" her lawyer asked, his voice losing its edge. I felt my racing pulse suddenly slow down to a calm, steady rhythm. For years, I had rehearsed this confrontation in my head, but I never imagined it with screaming or dramatic speeches. I just wanted the quiet truth to finally arrive. The judge looked past the lawyers, locking his eyes directly onto mine with a serious nod. "Mr. Vance," he said, "would you like to explain the contents of these financial records to the court?" I stood up from my chair, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on my shoulders. Across the aisle, my stepmother's unbreakable composure began to visibly fracture. The polished wooden benches, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, and the curious whispers of the spectators all seemed to fade into the background. For the very first time in my existence, I was not the terrified, broken teenager she could easily manipulate or the struggling young adult she could publicly humiliate. In just a matter of moments, every single person in that room was going to uncover the massive deception she had spent 23 years desperately trying to bury. "The absolute truth is," I began, my voice echoing clearly through the microphone, "she is not the person who saved my life." And for the first time since we walked through those courthouse doors, absolute terror flashed across her face. "My name is Julian Vance, and for the vast majority of my life, my entire identity was defined solely by my stepmother's toxic narrative. To the rest of the world, I was a difficult, troublesome kid who was incredibly lucky she ever took me in. Every single milestone I achieved, from my academic honors to my career advancements, was twisted into a testament of her supposed sacrifice rather than my own grueling hard work. If I excelled in school, she claimed credit for her strict guidance. If I landed a great job, she told everyone she pulled the strings. After a while, our family members stopped asking for my side of the story entirely because her voice was always the loudest. I learned at a very young age that defending myself only invited more chaos, as my stepmother possessed a terrifying talent for altering reality. She could cry on cue, manipulate conversations effortlessly, and make completely rational people question their own eyesight and sanity. My biological father passed away when I was only 9 years old, leaving a massive void in my life. After his sudden departure, she seized total control of every household decision, every financial account, and every single piece of our family history. Our extended family only saw a grieving, hard-working widow doing her absolute best to raise a young boy completely on her own. They never saw the hidden bank statements, the intercepted letters from my grandparents, or the incredible opportunities that mysteriously vanished whenever I tried to show a sliver of independence. I spent my youth being drastically underestimated because I chose to remain completely silent through her constant emotional abuse. People always assume that silence equates to weakness or compliance, but they failed to realize that while she was busy spinning her elaborate web of lies, I was quietly gathering the receipts. Her betrayals were never loud or dramatic enough to attract outside attention, which is precisely why they were so devastatingly effective over the years. My stepmother always preferred inflicting slow, agonizing cuts rather than opening glaring wounds that people could easily see and question. At large family dinners, she would beam warmly at me before whispering to an aunt about how fragile my mental state was whenever someone offered me a genuine compliment. The entire table would chuckle softly, and I would force a tight smile while she basked in the sympathy of the room. When I saved up enough money to purchase my very first vehicle, she immediately informed the neighbors that she had provided the down payment. She had not contributed a single penny to that car, but I vividly remember watching her calmly sip her tea as she lied, never once looking me in the eye. At my college graduation party, she introduced me to her friends as the fragile boy she practically carried across the finish line. The phrase sounded endearing to outsiders, but she always delivered it with a calculated pause, letting the words remind me who held the power. Even after I packed my bags and moved into my own apartment, her destructive pattern did not stop. Vital documents mysteriously vanished from the family safe whenever I asked specific questions regarding my late father's inheritance and estate. Phone calls with my aunts and uncles would end abruptly the moment certain financial topics were brought up. Relatives who had once been incredibly warm and supportive suddenly grew cold and distant after spending an afternoon visiting with her. None of these incidents were enough to prove anything legally on their own, but when stacked together over time, the pieces formed an undeniable picture of systemic greed. I began noticing the subtle, nervous glances she exchanged with her closest friends whenever our family conversations drifted too close to my father's old business ventures. I saw the sudden tightening around her eyes and the frantic, clumsy way she would change the subject to something entirely trivial. It was not a look of guilt that I was seeing. It was pure, unadulterated fear of exposure. The more I paid attention to her body language, the more I realized she was not protecting her pristine reputation. She was protecting a massive criminal secret. The precise moment that changed the entire trajectory of my life did not actually happen inside a court of law, but in a dusty archive room. It occurred on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while I was searching for archived property deeds after yet another exhausting argument where she insisted my father left absolutely nothing behind. Her response during that phone call had been far too fast, far too rehearsed, and for the first time in my life, I refused to just accept her word. A sympathetic county clerk handed me a weathered cardboard box of old records that had not been opened in over 15 years. Inside that box lay original property titles, hidden trust fund agreements, and personal letters explicitly addressed to me by my father. My hands went completely numb as I read the faded ink. Several of the most crucial financial documents carried my father's genuine signature, while others detailed massive monetary movements made just weeks after his funeral. As I systematically read through the old files, a dark pattern emerged with terrifying, undeniable clarity. Generous assets that my father had legally set aside to secure my future had been systematically transferred, liquidated, or funneled into private accounts controlled exclusively by my stepmother. Nothing seemed overtly illegal to an untrained eye, but absolutely none of it aligned with the bleak financial story she had fed me for 2 decades. For nearly 2 hours, I sat in that quiet room turning pages in absolute silence while years of confusion suddenly organized themselves into a crystal-clear reality. The definitive proof came from a final letter my father had penned to our estate lawyer just days before his passing. It was a heartbreakingly honest letter detailing a secure future for me that my stepmother completely intercepted and hid away. Walking out into the rain that afternoon, I did not feel a rush of anger or a desire for immediate revenge. I only felt an unshakable sense of certainty. The secret was out, and I immediately stopped trying to fight her with emotional words. I did not confront her right away because doing so would have given her the chance to destroy the evidence. Instead, I approached the entire situation like a professional investigator, utilizing patience, meticulous documentation, and cold facts. By that point in my life, I had spent 3 years working as a corporate forensic analyst, a job that trained me to spot minor inconsistencies and follow complex paper trails. Those professional skills became infinitely more dangerous to her than any screaming match ever could have been. Every single evening after my regular shifts, I sat at my desk reviewing old bank ledgers and obtaining certified copies of court filings. Dates that previously seemed completely random suddenly connected perfectly, revealing a clear sequence of calculated theft that was impossible for anyone to deny. I kept exhaustive notes, omitting any personal theories or emotional language, focusing entirely on verifiable financial data. Whenever I stumbled upon a major discrepancy, I secretly consulted independent legal professionals rather than reaching out to biased family members. An experienced estate attorney reviewed the documents, while an outside accountant independently verified the secret transfers. Neither of them knew my stepmother personally, which made their objective professional evaluations incredibly valuable for my upcoming case. Nearly a year passed in total secrecy, during which my stepmother continued telling her friends how much she had sacrificed to keep me afloat. I attended every single family event, nodded politely at her insults, and never dropped a single hint about what I had uncovered. She completely mistook my cooperative silence for absolute surrender, which ultimately proved to be her downfall. By the time our legal proceedings finally commenced, I was not relying on childhood memories or vague accusations of emotional abuse. I possessed official bank transcripts, certified property deeds, and expert financial testimonies packed neatly inside a legal folder. The courtroom remained completely breathless for several seconds after my opening statement concluded. For the very first time, the woman who always had an answer for everything sat in absolute silence. Her arrogant confidence completely evaporated as the judge began flipping through the certified documents in front of him. There were no dramatic theatrical outbursts from the bench, just the heavy sound of paper rustling through the microphones. The judge scrutinized the evidence piece by piece while my legal counsel calmly explained the fraudulent timeline we had spent a year constructing. The independent financial reviews left absolutely no room for interpretation or debate. I watched her lawyer's face slowly turn a pale shade of gray as he realized the sheer magnitude of what they were up against. The deeper he read into the forensic accounting notes, the less he attempted to object or defend his client. My stepmother sat completely frozen, her eyes wide with shock as her carefully constructed world shattered around her. The judge lifted a specific bank transfer document, looking down at her with a look of profound disappointment. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "this official record directly contradicts your sworn testimony under oath." Those words completely sealed her fate. The long-term consequences of that day did not hit our family all at once, but rather unfolded over the following months. Several relatives called me in tears to apologize for believing her lies, while others simply did not know how to face me. For over 20 years, they had been fed a single, toxic narrative, and many deeply regretted never looking deeper into the situation. A few stubborn family members chose to remain by her side, which I fully expected, as people rarely abandon their deeply ingrained beliefs overnight. I did not waste my energy arguing with them because the official court records had already spoken the definitive truth. The biggest transformation, however, belonged entirely to me. For my entire life, I had mistakenly measured my own self-worth through the warped, negative mirror she held up to my face. Her constant criticisms and systematic degradation had almost convinced me that I was inherently flawed and unworthy of happiness. That courtroom victory completely shattered that illusion, not because I walked away with my rightful inheritance, but because I finally saw my own strength. Many people spend their whole lives carrying heavy labels handed to them by toxic people, but the truth possesses a strange, beautiful patience that outlasts any lie. A year after that fateful court hearing, my daily life felt wonderfully ordinary, and that peace was exactly what made it so beautiful. The legal battles were completely finished, and the assets my father had intended for my future were finally secured in my name. Some family relationships slowly began to heal, while other toxic connections faded away naturally into the past. My stepmother and I have not spoken a single word to each other since the day the judge handed down his final ruling. The truth had already done what a lifetime of screaming matches never could. It drew a permanent line between us. What surprised me most about the entire experience was how little I actually cared about revenge once the dust settled. For the longest time, I foolishly believed that justice would feel like a loud, triumphant victory over my enemy. Instead, it just felt like an overwhelming sense of quiet freedom. I no longer wake up in the middle of the night wondering if I am the terrible person she claimed I was. The painful narrative that followed me since childhood no longer belongs to her. It belongs entirely to me, and I am finally moving forward.